Every once in a while, I will get an idea for a project that just ends up being a lot more than I anticipated. But by the time I realize that it's way more than I anticipated, I've put in so much time and effort that to back out would actually just mean that I wasted all the hours I already put into the project. So I just double down and finish it out. This video has been one such project. The premise of the idea was pretty straightforward. I've seen all of these articles describing open world game design and how a lot of these studios will settle on a 30-second rule or a 40-second rule, essentially trying to make sure that there's something of interest or something that captures the player's mind and attention every 40 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever their rule happens to be. That way you're constantly interested in what's going on around you. You never feel as though you're running around in an empty world that's not alive. There's always something of interest going on. And so I decided to try this out for myself and test it to see if it actually held up to scrutiny. However, I realized very quickly that I couldn't do this with just one game because then I'd have nothing to compare it to. So I decided that I would compare it to a second game, at which point I figured that that also would be just two random examples. I might as well compare it to a third. Now you see why this got so big and out of control so quickly. I decided to play for 2 hours The Witcher 3, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and also Fallout New Vegas, timing it such that I can track how long it is between each significant event that captures my interest. So at first I thought this would be relatively simple to do. I would play The Witcher 3 for 2 hours, during which I'd have my phone and I would just plop through my timer app and then lap it every time I came across something of interest. However, about 20 minutes into this experiment, I realized that I was playing the game differently than if I weren't looking for things of interest. I was actually playing the game, looking around, trying to see if something would capture my attention, and so that simply didn't work. I had to rethink it. So I settled on a much less efficient way of doing it, which was to simply sit down and play through the game for 2 hours without focusing on timing anything or going through and doing anything. Just sit down for 2 hours and play the game. Now, I did avoid any major side quests or anything of major significance. I did allow myself to do some Witcher contracts, hunt down some beasts, collect stuff, make some potions, and find new armor, things like that. But mainly I was focused on exploring, because after all, this is an experiment to figure out how these games are able to make such an intriguing and living world. And after all, if we were to look at the main quests, that wouldn't actually help us determine if any sort of open world design were effective, because we wouldn't be exploring the open world. We'd be going through a quest that's very linear and structured. We'd be having conversations, and it wouldn't be as useful in figuring this out. So I tried to just stick to exploring, both in The Witcher 3, in Breath of the Wild, and also New Vegas. And as you can imagine, this took a fair amount of time. Of course, playing through the games for 2 hours apiece wasn't a huge chore. I enjoy these games, and I picked these games because they happen to be some of my favorites of all time. So I actually enjoyed that part of the video production process. The part that was a little more taxing was going back through the footage I captured of myself playing through the 2 hours of these games with my phone, actually going through and lapping every single time something caught my interest, to the point where my, I guess, task that I was trying to complete would be diverted. My attention would be diverted onto something different. Now, of course, I should make it very clear that this is not a purely scientific test. Of course, it is limited to my attention span or what catches my interest. I ran past many things that I didn't skip a beat on that would interest somebody else, but because of the way I was playing the game, I didn't divert attention or go pick that flower or go interact with those enemies. That didn't affect me. So this is purely for me, but I think I'm a fair representative, especially over the course of 2 hours of gameplay for each of these games, to the general public or populace. That's the word I was looking for, or one of them. So after this, I had a big list for each of the games based on the actual time in between events of interest, at least as I deemed them looking back on the recordings, something that altered the way I was playing and diverted my attention. Each one of those got a lap, and then a new lap would begin. Now I do want to say I did cut out certain segments, so for instance, if I began an interaction with an opponent or an enemy of some sort, I didn't wait the full minute and a half, 2 minutes that it took for me to finish that opponent and then move on to something else in order to treat that as a different sort of time in between moments of interest. I find that entire moment a moment of interest, so instead I cut those larger segments out and instead only focused on the time in between significant interactions, if that makes sense. I then put all of this data into Excel, which is what you're seeing right now, and this spreadsheet basically allowed me to capture all of this data and to do some interesting calculations based off of it. What I did is I made sure that each of the interactions was given its own slot, and then I was able to calculate the average time in between significant moments of interest and also go through and calculate and actually create a graph to demonstrate what we were seeing visually. And this chart actually explains pretty much what I'm talking about and surmises everything and all the data that I captured throughout the course of this experiment. And what I found was that The Witcher 3 tended to average about 32.2 seconds in between each moment of diverted attention or interest that intrigued me to the point where I wanted to go investigate that or know more about it, at least as far as I determined afterwards. In terms of Zelda Breath of the Wild, it ended up being 41.8 seconds in average form between each significant interaction, and for Fallout New Vegas, it ended up being 48.8 seconds in between each moment of interest. Now again, I want to stress that this is based on my gameplay, this is based on the area I was exploring in the game, this is based on 2 hours of gameplay. It's certainly not indicative of everybody's experience. Some people are going to find something of interest every 2 minutes in The Witcher 3 because they're going to be oblivious to other elements and they're just going to be looking for certain, for instance, enemy interactions. Everything else is kind of a moot point. Same with Breath of the Wild. It depends on the player, but for me, this is how it stacked up. In total, in Fallout New Vegas, I ended up with 154 moments of interest or intrigue where my attention was diverted over the course of a 2-hour run of the game. With regards to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, I ended up with 190 individual moments of interest, and with The Witcher 3, I ended up with exactly 250 moments of interest shift in those 2 hours of gameplay, which I actually find pretty cool. And I know, let me just say, this seems like a very mathematical or academic approach to creating a living, breathing world, but this is how a lot of these game studios tend to approach designing these worlds, is they want to make sure that every 30 seconds or 40 seconds or 50 seconds, you will come across something of interest so that you never feel as though you're running through an empty world. What I found was in Breath of the Wild, there tended to be large moments of extremes where sometimes I wouldn't see anything of interest for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but I was always headed towards something that I found interesting earlier that I thought was worthy of my interest. So it was almost like a goal. I wasn't seeing individual things that piqued my interest during those 2 or 3 minutes, but I was headed towards a mountain peak or I was climbing up the side of a cliff that I knew I wanted to get to the top of. So of course there's some exceptions in here, which is why we took the average. But this is how they tend to design these games, and they want to make sure that everything follows these rules roughly. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that this project, the entire idea for it started with The Witcher 3 and some of those interviews that came out discussing the 40-second rule, which CD Projekt Red used when designing the world to make sure that roughly every 40 seconds there was something of interest. And what I found was that that was actually true, except for me, it ended up being 32.2 seconds in between each interesting and worthy interaction or distracting event. With Breath of the Wild, it was a little bit longer, but with that game, remember, you're dealing with a lot more verticality than in The Witcher 3. You're climbing stuff, you're parachuting down stuff. It's a different game, and it's meant to be a different experience. And the attention span for Breath of the Wild tends, in my experience, to be a little bit longer than The Witcher 3. In The Witcher 3, there's a lot more to do. There's all sorts of potions and things you have to manage while in combat, things that you might not necessarily have to deal with on as stringent a level in Breath of the Wild. And with regards to Fallout New Vegas being 48.8 seconds, that seems like a much longer time in between each interaction, especially when you consider we're taking the average, which is true, but again, that's because you're dealing with a different world and a different experience intended. With Fallout New Vegas, you're supposed to be going through a wasteland. There shouldn't necessarily be something of incredible interest every 10 feet when you're going through that game. In Breath of the Wild, same thing. You're going through a vast expanse that is massive, and the fact that they could get that down to 41.8 seconds for me is frankly kind of amazing. And with regards to The Witcher 3, also an incredibly massive game, but the game world also allows much more life to be within it so that it can seem much more interesting, to the point where every 32.2 seconds you're finding something of interest. All in all, this is a relatively short video, but it was a video that I have been wanting to make for a while because it was really interesting to me whether or not this would actually pan out. Everyone says there's a 40-second rule in The Witcher 3, but nobody really wanted to test it, or at least nobody was stupid enough to waste like an entire week trying to go through it and make it happen. So there you go. All in all, I'm not really sure what you want to do with this information now that you have it, but I found it at the very least interesting to go through these games 2 hours apiece and calculate out whether or not they actually held to the rules they were designed with. And it turns out they actually were, and they actually are spaced out based on what the game was designed to be about. They didn't stick to a 30-second rule because they wanted to keep your attention. No, they actually held to the truth of the worlds they were designing. Specifically with, for instance, Fallout New Vegas, they understood that that world shouldn't be as jam-packed as the other games. And also, there were technological restrictions on the previous generation of consoles. Of course, you can make that argument, but whatever. So yeah, I'm not really sure how to end this video other than saying thank you for watching and rewarding me in some small way for potentially wasting so much of my time. But if even one person finds this interesting to the point where you would like to leave a like on the video, I consider it a win nonetheless. So thank you for watching. I love you all. If you like what you saw here and would like to see more of me wasting my time with these sorts of things, make sure to subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon. It would mean the world to me. And with all this said, I will also mention that a lot of you have been asking what my next ultimate critique is going to be on. I've actually begun work on it, and there is a clue throughout this entire video if you can spot it as to what game that is. I'm not going to say, I'm going to leave it up to your imagination and to your deductive skills. If you have any ideas, leave it down below. I'm sure others have their own ideas as well. But that's it from me. Thank you for watching. I love you all. Peace out. Bye-bye.